Okay, moving on to chapter 8, wages of labor. Several key points. High wages are caused by the increase of national wealth, and wages are not high in stationary countries and still lower in declining countries. And finally, high wages are an advantage to society. Now, let's talk about the first point, increasing national wealth, and why does it increase wage? Let's imagine a nation is getting richer and richer. What does it mean? That means the funds intended for employing laborers is increasing in this country, right? Which means the demand for laborers increases. And what happens when demand for something increase and the supply is not keeping up? The price will rise, right? So in this case, wages will increase. Hence, it's the increase, not the actual greatness of national wealth that leads to high wages. Smith gave an example, the North American colonies, the English North American colonies. Both the nominal and real wages are higher. The nominal wage being the wage in money and real wage being the amount of food, right? The amount of necessary food that these nominal wages can buy. So the money wages are higher in North America than in England. And also the money price of food is actually lower in North America than England. That means the actual subsistence, this actual food that you can acquire, a laborer can acquire in North America is so much more than his counterpart in England can acquire. Although England is a richer country than the North American colonies. And here just shows you the mad progress of North America, right? North American colonies. You can Smith mentioned that the European population has not doubled in the past 500 years. But as we know, later on, after the Industrial Revolution, it actually rose up pretty rapidly. But remember, this is a book published in the late 1700s. The Industrial Revolution has not occurred yet. But in the North American colonies, right, it doubles about every 20 to 25 years. So in the footnote note of the edition of this book that I'm reading, we can see the population in New England, right? New England being the colony of Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, I think what else? New York as well, right? Connecticut and so on, right? This piece of land. In the year 1643, the population is only 21K, right? But in the year 1760, the population rose to 500K. In Virginia, in 1703, population 60K, and then rose to 5 times, right, in 1755. Pretty impressive growth. And what's even more amazing is, as mentioned by Smith, there were actually more people leaving North America, coming back to Europe, than people from England and the European continent coming into North America. So what that means is this rising population is mainly due to the people multiplying on this land than people immigrating from outside. Very impressive. And he mentioned that it was not uncommon for a person who live to his or her old age to see 50 to 100 descendants in their own lifetime. Holy cow. And then widows with a widow with 4 children will be courted like some sort of treasure in North America, which is something totally unimaginable in the European continent. Uh, yeah, so I guess it's because there's just way too many fertile land to be cultivated, right? And not enough labor to work this land, right? And whatever labor you put into that land will produce a very good result. Because as for new colony, right, the land being so plenty, of course you pick the most fertile land to cultivate. Okay. Now let's move on to another example. China, right? A stagnating nation, at least in the time when Smith was describing it. So wages are not increasing in a stationary country, however rich, right? Because after a long time, the population would catch up with the funds for paying laborers, right? So you have a certain amount of richness that you have reached a long time ago, and of course the population will grow until it satisfies the demand, right? Uh, it cannot grow beyond that. Beyond that, then people will get poor and they won't be able to feed themselves, and population will decline. It's just a typical demand supply situation, right? So he mentioned that artificers, right? So these little craftsmen uh, in Europe, they just sit in their shop waiting for their customers to come. Whereas those in China, they would be yelling and running around on the street, trying to grab their customer, get their attention to sell their things, right? So yeah, this is just a little, not little, part of a drawing from the Song Dynasty, kind of depicting uh, what it's like on the streets of the capital back then. You can see many little shops, pedestrians walking around, these little craftsmen, shopkeepers, those people who are driving the little boats and so on. Yeah. Yeah, you can see it's a very busy street. They probably are shouting to the people walking by, hey, buy this, buy that, right? And interesting enough, Smith is aware of certain group of people in southern China who do not have any piece of land to live and then end up living in boats. We call them damming in Chinese. Um, yeah, so it's quite interesting. He's very knowledgeable about the East as well. Yeah, and lastly, declining national wealth. That's even worse situation than stagnating national wealth, right? So he mentioned that in such case, you will have little funds to be used to employ the laborer, but there are more laborers than what can be employed with these funds. So what ends up happening is these laborers, they compete intensely for these employments, right? And that drives down the wage. And due to such low wage, the laborers, they cannot possibly feed their own children well. And as a result, not that many children survive to adulthood. And those who do survive live in shitty situation as well. So population decline, right? Some example, Bengal, I think, that means Bangladesh, and some English settlements in the East Indies. What he meant by East Indies should be English colonies in Southeast Asia. So why the difference, right? You see the North American English colonies versus the English colonies in the East Indies. Why the difference? Well, because the North American colonies, they are governed by the British Constitution. I guess provides more law and order and more security to people who live there. But the East Indies were managed by the East India Company, whose primary focus, I suppose, is to make revenue, right? And the company probably does not care too much about the well-being of the people, and then just abuse the crap out of them, and then don't manage things very well, and then be very short-sighted, no long-term planning whatsoever. That's just my guess. I haven't digged deep into that. I believe later on in the book, this matter will be dived in further. And he mentioned that high wages is a blessing, and here are the reasons. High earnings of laborers are an advantage to society. Why? As we mentioned before, poverty restricts population growth, and less population means less labor to produce value, and of course you're going to be poor. And also he made an interesting comment on let's skip the comment on slavery and get to the next point. Okay, the increase of stock, which is the cause of high wage, as we mentioned before, does not only cause the raise of wage, right? Because when stock increase, what he means is, I guess the stock has several meanings here. The fund being used to employ laborers, perhaps the machines in a manufacturing plant, and also cattle on a farm. These can all be stock, right? So when your stock increase, that means more investment is made in more machinery and more improvement of land, because if you have more cow, you have more instruments to plow the land, and you also have more cow manure to fertilize the land as well, right? So these all increase the productive power of labor, right? So you have two kind of counterbalancing forces. One is the high demand for labor, rising the wage, and the other one is more improvement as increased stock. The productive power of labor goes up. That means you can get more output per unit input labor. And these two forces balancing each other out, perhaps the latter one even stronger. So as a result, you may have lower overall price, although wages are higher. Okay, and also let's go back to the comment on slavery. Smith has a very interesting perspective on slavery. He mentioned that slavery is more expensive than freeman. Why? Because a freeman, when he's, I guess maybe tired or injured or whatever, he manages his conditions in a frugal manner, right? Whereas the overseers of the slaves manage slaves in a very careless manner. And when something is being managed carelessly, of course, there's a lot of waste, unnecessary waste. So overall, freeman is cheaper than slave. And this is not related to the main train of thoughts, but I just find it interesting, his comment on labor rights, and just to show you how far we have gone in improving labor rights over time. So in his time, right, the law at least in England, does not prohibit the combination of master. Combination here meaning, I guess, collusion, right? And in the case of workers, that would be union, but there are no new unions in his time, because the law prohibits the collusion, the combination of workmen, and also masters, right? The bosses, they can hold out much longer. They're rich. The workers can go on strike for a little while, and the boss can still live in a decent condition. But the workmen cannot, right? They rely on their income. They rely on their employment. They cannot subsist too long without employment, and that's why the masters are more powerful.